Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Woodrow Wilson, and the focus is rapid political rise. The year is 1910. It's actually a bitter period for Woodrow Wilson as he had suffered a couple of major defeats as the Princeton president. His quadrangle plan had been voted down by the Board of Trustees. He'd lost out on the location of the graduate school to the Dean Andrew West of that school. Sort of a bitter period. He had lost his closest friend, Jack Hibben, who claimed a disloyalty over that, and he sort of cut Hibben out of his life. This was not great times, and maybe the perfect time for somebody else to walk into his life, and that somebody was Colonel George Harvey. George Harvey was a political operative in the state of New Jersey and New York, a Democrat who was looking to get somebody new into the mix to run for governor of New Jersey. He had seen Wilson speak, and he was impressed. He thought maybe he was his man. Well, for Wilson, this was pretty much perfect. Things weren't going very well at Princeton, and besides, he had become a lawyer and a professor mainly as a path to getting to where he really wanted, which was politics. He wanted to be a statesman. He wanted to apply all that he had learned, all of his theories, in the real world, help people out, use government for the greater good. Well, Harvey connected with James Smith, the other key player in this race. Now, Smith was a true political boss. He was the man behind the curtain of a lot of Democratic victories in politics in the state of New Jersey. He's a former U.S. Senator himself. Pretty much everybody owed him something, and so if he got behind you, there's a good chance the Democratic Party would get behind you and you would get the nomination. And Smith and Harvey were watching Wilson. They saw him as, yes, a novice, but he connected really well with people, and they thought, as a novice, maybe they could control him once he became governor. That part, they didn't know him very well, but they're still going to push for him. But the one thing everybody wanted to know in the party was, would he support the party organization? So Wilson came out July of 1910 with a speech to the Lawyers Club of New York, and he said, I've always been a believer in party organizations. If I were elected governor, I should be very glad to consult with the leaders of the Democratic organization. I should refuse to listen to no man, but I should be especially glad to hear and duly consider the suggestions of my party. This is exactly what the political operatives wanted to hear, and the bosses were pushing Woodrow Wilson when it came time for that nominating convention in September of 1910, taking place in Trenton, New Jersey, and sure enough, with the bosses behind him, Woodrow Wilson got that nomination on the first ballot. He's just a dozen or so miles away. He got the call, got in a car, came over, and gave an in-person acceptance speech. Now, a lot of folks had read Woodrow Wilson before, but a lot of the political operatives had never seen him speak, and this was his most forceful political asset, really, was his oratory, kind of mesmerizing in this address. Joe Tumulty was one of those in attendance. Now, Tumulty was a political operative in the state of New Jersey. He was at the convention to support a different candidate, but he was impressed with Wilson. Really, the speech kind of blew him away. He met with Wilson, signed on to the campaign, became Wilson's personal secretary, later his chief of staff, basically held that role for the next dozen years. In terms of the campaign, Wilson would go up against the Republican Vivian, but he really more focusing on his own campaigning, on himself, positioning himself as a reformer, as a progressive, somebody who believed that you could use government to help the people and do some good in the world, regulate corporations, perhaps control public utilities better, protect workers, which was something important to the progressives. But Wilson also had his eyes on the biggest prize, because people were already talking, if this newcomer could win the governorship of New Jersey, maybe he could win the presidency in 1912. And so some of his addresses had a lot of patriotic flair, including a speech in Atlantic City. America is not a piece of the surface of the earth, according to Wilson. America is not merely a body of towns. America is an idea. America is an ideal. America is a vision. Woodrow Wilson wanted to have his place in this. Now, the Republicans tried to paint Wilson as the political boss candidate, part of the machine politics that a lot of people didn't like. And George Record was one of these Republicans who wrote an open letter to Wilson, 19 questions, trying to paint him in a corner. Well, Wilson was very bold in his response, coming out against political machines. He responded to Record, "If elected, I shall not, either in the matter of appointments to office or assent to legislation or in shaping any part of the policy of my administration, submit to the dictation of any person or persons, special interest or organization. I should deem myself forever disgraced should I in even the slightest degree cooperate in any such system or any such transactions as you describe in your characterization of the boss system." Well, what did the bosses think about this? They were the ones who pretty much had put Wilson on the political map, handing him the nomination. Well, their response, they called it a great campaign play. They didn't think he was being serious. Again, they didn't know Woodrow Wilson all that well. The general election campaign was a sprint, 6 weeks, about 50 speeches for Wilson. He spoke in every one of the 21 counties. He won big. This was not a close election. Wilson won by about 11 percentage points, Democratic pickups in both houses. He was going to have majorities, able to pursue his agenda. But he had a controversy right at the beginning. That political boss, James Smith, came back and said, "You know what? I'd like to go back to the U.S. Senate." And the state legislature in the next month was going to pick the next senator from New Jersey, and he wanted it. But Woodrow Wilson, the governor-elect, was balking. The primary system was still relatively new in the United States, a chance for the people to pick nominees for political office. In New Jersey, it held a primary for the senator role, and a James Martine was the candidate who won that primary. Well, Smith and the bosses thought, well, this is just advisory. The legislature can go with whoever they wanted, and technically that was true. But Wilson said, no, this is democracy. This is the people and their voice, and we need to pay attention to it. Now, whether he not wanted to just pick a fight with the bosses and so he could get his independence, or he firmly believed that Martine had to have this job, the battle lines were drawn, and Woodrow Wilson was just 1 week into his governorship. And he and Tumulty are up at night calling legislators deep into the night, and Smith is doing the same from his hotel room, and they came together to vote, and the winner in this case was Woodrow Wilson, getting Martine that spot in the United States Senate. James Smith had a huge fall over this. Woodrow Wilson clearly on the rise. He was the man in charge in the state of New Jersey. Now, Wilson continued to believe that the British system of government was the preferred one, parliamentary systems where executives worked directly with their colleagues in the legislature to come up with legislation, and Woodrow Wilson wanted to do something similar in the state of New Jersey, but he didn't reach out just to Democrats. He also reached across the aisle, and there was that man, George Record, who had tried to paint him in the corner initially during the campaign. Well, Record was also a progressive reformer, and they got aligned, and they started passing legislation. All of a sudden, for the progressives in the Democratic Party, on a national basis, we're starting to think Woodrow Wilson might be their man. Well, Wilson got a sense of this. He started going on the road, making speeches across the country, talking about his reforms, connecting with the people. Also, the Democrats had only one president since before the Civil War. Now, that was Grover Cleveland, who is currently serving as a trustee at Princeton. Wilson knew quite well, didn't get along with all that well. But Cleveland had been the only Democratic president. Wilson wanted to be the next one. And for this, again, he's around the country. He's starting to meet people, some power players. And one of them was Colonel Edward House. Now, House was an independently wealthy Texan who had become a bit of a kingmaker in political circles in the state of Texas. And the two hit it off immediately. They bonded over their Southern roots. They bonded over their fondness for the British system of government. And most interesting about House is he wanted to help, and it seemed like he truly wanted nothing from Wilson in return. According to Wilson, what I like about Colonel House is that he holds things at arm's length objectively. He seems able to penetrate a proposition and get to its very essence quickly. He wants nothing for himself. He will not hold office and is a truly disinterested friend, the most valuable possession a man could have. Very rare in politics, but seemed genuine that House could be a great political ally. Seemed like he was just interested in helping out Wilson. Well, this was a good timing to be thinking about the presidency because there was a setback in New Jersey politics. The next round of elections, they lost some seats in the state legislature. It was going to be harder for him to get stuff done. So He just continued to focus now on the presidential run, which is going to be wide open because the Republican Party was completely fractured. Former President Theodore Roosevelt had come back from his vacation, his safari, his trip to Europe that he did after leaving the presidency. He came back and there were complaints throughout his progressive followers about his handpicked successor, William Taft, currently serving as president. Well, Roosevelt was convinced that Taft was too conservative. He was not fulfilling his vision of what he thought his successor should do, so he came back to run against Taft, and he basically broke the Republican Party. At the Republican convention, they actually stuck with Taft because the old guard kind of ran the convention. Roosevelt claimed fraud. Again, sort of a mixed confusion over the primary system with this convention as well, and he refused to give in. So what happened? Taft was the Republican nominee. Theodore Roosevelt went across town and started his own party, the Progressive Party. They held their own convention, and now you've got two Republicans ostensibly running against the one Democrat. Well, this was handing things to whoever was going to win the Democratic nomination. As Woodrow Wilson knew it, he said, good old Teddy, what a help he is, because Roosevelt, by fracturing the Republican Party, had basically opened things up for the Democrats. Would Wilson be that nominee? Well, it was Wilson and Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House, who were kind of the favorites going into the convention in Baltimore for the Democrats. You also had a former Ohio governor, Judson Harman, in the mix, and Oscar Underwood, the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. They got a bunch of votes early on, but it really became a two-person race, with Clark out on top, Wilson number two. But importantly, in Democratic politics, a majority wasn't enough. You had to get to a two-thirds supermajority at these conventions, and that was going to be hard for Clark to do. Clark got the majority on the 9th ballot, but he really didn't have a path to the supermajority. William Jennings Bryan, who had been the former standard bearer of the Democratic Party, was at the convention, and he came out for Wilson on the 14th ballot, helped Wilson get more votes. Wilson finally took the majority himself on the 30th ballot. He went over the top. It took 46 ballots, but Woodrow Wilson was the nominee of the Democratic Party. The general election was really going to be Wilson against Roosevelt. Both of them basically ignored Taft. Taft didn't really want to be president anymore. His heart wasn't in the campaign. He kind of wanted to keep Roosevelt from winning because of some of the conflict between them. But it was mostly Wilson against Roosevelt, and Roosevelt the most aggressive, attacking Wilson, even though practically they were actually not that different on policy. Roosevelt had his new nationalism. Roosevelt had his new freedom. This is what they called their vision and version of progressivism. Both very strong on this count. Really the only difference was personality. Wilson much more sort of formal, almost stoic at times, but very powerful orator, whereas Roosevelt emotional, pounding his fist, the big smile, the big laugh. But even Roosevelt admitted, I suppose I'm a little hard on Wilson. What I objected to about him is his mildness of method. I suppose, as a matter of fact, tapping himself on the chest, Wilson is merely a less virile me. That's about right. Very different personality, but in terms of their politics, not that different. One question for Wilson that he finally had to address late in the campaign, because it kept coming up, was civil rights. Now, Wilson, who had been from the South, had been enamored with the South, a Southern sympathizer in many ways, kind of ignored the topic, but until pressed, he finally came out with the following statement in a letter to Bishop Alexander Waters. To my colored fellow citizens, of my earnest wish to see justice done them in every matter, and not mere grudging justice, but justice executed with liberality and cordial good feeling. Blacks may count upon me for absolute fair dealing and for everything by which I could assist in advancing the interests of their race in the United States. Sounded good? Have to be seen how that would play out if Wilson could become the president. Well, the election was really not much of a question, and it was not close because Roosevelt fracturing the Republican Party had handed the Democrats the presidency, Wilson getting 435 votes in the Electoral College. Roosevelt was second with 88. William Taft, the incumbent president, won just 2 states, 8 votes in the Electoral College. But the popular vote, very different story. In this case, Wilson won only 41.8% of the popular vote, the third lowest in American history. Roosevelt and Taft combined for almost 51% of the popular vote, over 1.3 million more votes than Wilson got. You can only imagine if the Republican Party had remained united, perhaps Woodrow Wilson would never have become President of the United States. But this is where we are 2 years. In the last 2 years, Wilson had gone from the president of Princeton to the governor of New Jersey to the president-elect of the United States. He's about to turn 56 years old, ready to put a lifetime of study into practice. That's the story for another day. That is Woodrow Wilson and rapid political rise from the life of Woodrow Wilson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.